All right, everyone, welcome. Happy LSW20. We're back. I said we'd be back. The last panel session teed up this session really well. They talked about employee ownership as one of the ways we could think about inclusive growth and a better economy. And so it happens we have this session about employee ownership with Ashley Ortiz, who's the statewide technical assistance specialist with the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center, or RMEOC. And I've admired RMEOC's work for many years. They're excellent as an organization to help companies not just understand what employee ownership is, but also how to do it and who to talk to and how to make a business do it. So I'm going to just turn this over to Ashley for her session. And I know she has some slides to go through. At any point, if you have questions or comments, please drop them into the chat on our Facebook feeds or on our YouTube feeds, and we'll make sure that Ashley can answer them. So Ashley, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's so great to be a part of Longmont Startup Week. As Morgan mentioned, I'm the Technical Assistance Specialist with RMEOC, and today I'm going to talk specifically about how business resilience relates to employee ownership. So I'm going to start out with a brief overview of the two main types of employee-owned businesses that you may have heard of, then talk a little bit specifically about how that relates to business resilience, especially in these super challenging times, and then end with a little bit about how the businesses are structured and governed, and then talk also about how you can start up one or convert a company if you already have one. So I'll talk for a while and then would love any questions. So thanks for being here. Quick overview of the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center. Our mission is to create a more inclusive economy through advancing and creating pathways to employee ownership. We provide education on employee ownership models and trends. We offer direct technical assistance to anyone who's looking to convert or start up different employee ownership models, and also help create a network of employee-owned business support. And hopefully all of that will help strengthen the sector as a whole. So I want to start real quickly with just some thoughts about what is employee ownership. It can manifest in multiple ways, but it does share some overriding principles. First, maybe obvious, is that employees own a financial share in the company. They have certain rights to participate in the governance of that company, and that ownership is offered broadly to anyone based on set criteria that the business can set specifically for their needs, and that ownership is held by a significant number and growing number of the employees of that business. So now switching to just a quick overview at first about what are pretty much the most well-known types of employee-owned companies, which you may or may not have heard of. The first is an ESOP, or an employee stock ownership plan. And also the other one is a worker-owned cooperative. And I wanted to point out here, you may have heard of the word co-op, and there's lots of different types of co-ops. For instance, there's also consumer-owned co-ops, which would be like grocery stores that you come across that say they're cooperatively owned. Also, like the equipment supply company REI is a consumer co-op. And there's even some hybrid models that are owned by both the workers and the consumers. But just for the purposes of today, when we're talking about employee ownership, we're really only talking about one type of co-op, which is this worker-owned co-op. And again, we'll go into more details of what really defines that later. But what's the difference between the two? This will help you understand what they are if you haven't heard of them as well. An ESOP is a situation in which a separate entity or a trust acquires some portion, sometimes all, of a company's stock, and it holds it for the benefit of an employee, of all the employees. The company generally appoints trustees then who administer the plan, and it's essentially a retirement benefit. The value of the shares depends on an annual independent valuation of the company. And typically employees receive the cash value of the shares in their account when they leave the company. And just for reference, one local company that is an ESOP that you may know in Longmont is Left Hand Brewing. So alternatively, a worker-owned co-op has a really different ownership structure, even though it is also employee-owned. And in this case, it's a business where every worker has an equal share in that business. And they also have one equal vote, no matter what their pay or seniority is. And the business is often managed using democratic principles. And a local example of a co-op is Namaste Solar, which is based in Boulder. One thing I wanted to point out here too is that with worker-owned co-ops, when you hear the notion about everyone having one equal vote, I think it's important to keep in mind that we're talking about a vote in governance and not in management or every decision that has to happen in the company every day, because that would definitely not be efficient, and these companies could then not compete with traditional companies. So when you hear that, we're talking about governance in terms of big strategic matters. That's when everyone comes together to make those larger votes. And otherwise, on a day-to-day basis, companies can set up all different kinds of structures to make decisions that make the company run. And just one example from my experience, I was a worker owner of a bakery in the Bay Area, one of the Arizmendi bakeries. And in our case, we decided to set up our decision-making based on a monthly meeting, which was called our GM, or General Managers Meeting. And that was the time when all of us as owners would come together and decide which of those governance decisions we needed to make collectively. But then we also set up a whole network of what we called empowered committees. So different groups of us would serve on different committees, like a marketing committee or a hiring and firing committee, production committees deciding what products we're going to make. And those committees could make those decisions all throughout the month on any given day without checking in with the whole group. And then even on the day-to-day basis on the production floor, as we're having to make those calls, any of us could make those smaller decisions. So it really does help with the efficiency. And I think it's just something important to keep in mind about co-ops. All right, so now moving back into ESOPs for a moment, I wanted to show a map so you can get a sense of how many types of ESOPs and how many there are around the country. This is data from the National Center for Employee Ownership, or NCEO. Also just wanted to note that's a really great overview company that does tons about employee ownership. So it's a great place to look for reference data and information. There's more than 6,500 ESOPs in the country right now, and with over 14 million participants in those businesses. And the different colors here represent different sectors. Yellow is service, green is manufacturing, blue is construction, and red is finance, insurance, and real estate, as just some examples. And ESOPs can range everywhere from small, community-based small businesses to large corporations. And the largest one in the country actually is Public Supermarkets, and they have more than 200,000 employee owners. And another local example you might be familiar with is Lever's Supermarkets, which is an ESOP. They also own Save-A-Lot and Colorado Ranch Markets. And now a quick snapshot of worker-owned or employee-owned co-ops nationwide. There's a lot fewer of these than ESOPs, about 400 total, with about 7,000 worker owners. And the larger worker-owned co-op is actually in New York City. It is called Cooperative Healthcare Associates, and they have close to 2,000 worker owners in one business. So again, these businesses work for very small, starting at around 3 people, all the way up to thousands of employees. And then a quick look at Colorado. This is another little snapshot of ESOPs, specifically in Colorado. In 2019, there were about 135 total. And we don't have a great count of co-ops, but we estimate there's about 40 to 50 in the state right now. And then we also think there might be some undercounting of both types because of what are these hybrid types I mentioned earlier. There are some businesses that are not fully co-ops, they're not fully ESOPs. But nationwide, we think there's about 3,700 more of those types of hybrids. And then just to put some names to some of these businesses, here's just a quick list of some, definitely not all, of the businesses in Colorado. I already mentioned a few: Namaste Solar, Lever's, Left Hand Brewing. and others. And you can see from this and the maps that they span all different industries, and they're both big and small companies. So now I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about business resilience and the current crisis that we're in. And as we all know, this current pandemic is hurting workers and the economy just in so many ways. And we don't even yet know the full extent at which that's going to affect businesses specifically. More than 33 million jobs have already been lost. Businesses are closing, local jobs are being lost. People starting businesses, as many of you know, I'm sure, and owners who might have been ready to retire are all now facing new hurdles, bigger challenges on all fronts, whether it's related to employee ownership or not. But I wanted to talk today about employee-owned businesses and how those can be a useful tool for possibly looking forward to better times and better business. So employee ownership is a really powerful tool that during times like this, it has the potential even to help us start to close the racial and wealth gap that we're seeing in the economy. Employee owners were 4 times less likely to be laid off during the 2008 recession, which saved $37 billion in federal unemployment benefits at that time. And EOs, through these different ups and downs that we've seen now, have shown to be more resilient in times of economic downturns, with greater productivity and greater longevity in terms of how long those businesses are around and which ones can make it through the crises. Another statistic from the 2008 crash showed us that the number of worker-owned cooperatives doubled in the US during that time. And in other parts of the world, worker-owned businesses have also been much more resilient than traditional companies. Hard times can really be key times to come together. People come together to look for help, either to start something new, to see if selling to employees might be an option, to explore before shutting down, and just a way to transition to a different structure that's going to help weather the challenges. And EO companies really create places where people can collectively share in the good times. Of course, we often talk about that, but it's also a time where you have a group of people to go to and make decisions with and weather the hard times. And one example I wanted to just point out briefly here is a really large worker-owned co-op, actually in the Bay Area as well, north of San Francisco in Petaluma, called Alvarado Street Bakery. And I was lucky enough to get to tour their production facility last year. They are a 35-year-old business. They started very, very small, making loaves of bread, and you might be familiar with them. They're at large grocery stores now and ship bread all over the world. But what I was thinking about with them in terms of business resilience is hearing their stories and walking through the plant and hearing all the different employees when I was there, when they were talking. A lot of their issues, of course, have been around technology. They went from very, very small production to baking bread at scales that they can ship worldwide. So as different technologies have come in, they've had to make really, really hard calls about getting more efficient, being able to make more bread, but having equipment take away jobs. And they've been able to, as a group, make those decisions collectively. So everyone there has a say in what's the balance, and should we get this new technology that's going to eliminate X number of jobs, or should we not and actually keep the jobs, and how's that going to relate to production? So it was just a really good example, I thought, of a way that people have made decisions over the time that they've been in business that's about not only themselves, but also the business. So they're a great example to look to if worker co-op is a direction you are thinking about. So now I was thinking I'd switch to benefits of employee ownership next. I think talking about some of those benefits can really help us understand why they do well during crises and are good things to look for. So a lot of these are things that you would imagine to be true. Employees tend to be more engaged and satisfied because they reap the benefits of their work and better business. And also just overall, they have a say in their workday, which feels good and leads to more engagement. EOs also keep more money in local economies, since all of the profits of those businesses are going back to the workers who are there, rather than shareholders who are remote and in other parts of the country or world. And then for existing businesses, there's a huge opportunity for employee ownership to be an option for succession, especially during challenging times when other options might not be there, or a shift needs to happen that you might not have been planning on. The silver tsunami, as you might hear it called, is happening right now, and about 60% of privately held companies right now are owned by people over 65 years old. So this will be what's estimated to be the largest wealth transfer actually in the history of this country, with 9 million businesses changing hands. So converting to employee ownership can be a great option for the workers and the owners from a productivity standpoint, and it also does have some tax benefits as well. So as an owner, you have likely a willing buyer, and you could keep the business open, hopefully, and all while staying true to the dream that you had for that business from the outset. So next, I want to dive a little bit deeper into what an ESOP is, and then also talk about what worker co-op is, and then give you a little overview of the governance structure, which we talked a little bit about before. But an ESOP, as I mentioned earlier, is basically a situation in which the employees own shares through an ESOP trust, and all employees participate in that once it's established. They can hold 100% of the company's stock or less. It doesn't have to be total. The ESOP holdings are not taxed at a company level. Rather, they're taxed at the distribution level. Let's see. The company makes contributions into the plan based on a formula similar to any other employer-sponsored retirement plan, like one that you might have at your current workplace. And an ESOP can borrow money to buy shares initially. And setting it up does take an investment. It can be upwards of $50,000 to $70,000. Usually that's a minimum on average. Full costs can be higher than that. That includes all the legalities around it, technical assistance, all of that. So as I mentioned too, it does require an annual valuation every year from that point forward. So it's pretty appropriate or advantageous for companies of 50 or more employees with 10 million or more in revenue. However, I wanted to mention that the actual legal minimum for setting up an ESOP is 10 employees and around 5 million in revenue. So it is possible to set it up with a smaller company. It's just something where you'd really want to be considering the cost to start and maintain the trust and the payouts in relation to the size of the company. And now a little bit about ESOP governance. Hopefully just this simple graphic will help you see what we've been talking about a little more clearly. At the high level here, we have the board of directors. And then you can see that that would be the new trust, the red entity on the right there. And the board appoints a trustee, which is going to help management communicate between the two. So overall, you can see here with the board communicating and the trustee is really the communication between the shareholders. This leads to much higher engagement, as you can imagine, from the employees. Higher trust, job satisfaction, retention, and even productivity, because more people are engaged and have a share of the profits that are manifested by the business. And really all of these things, as you can imagine, come with a greater participatory culture and management structure. And here's just another quick story to give some real faces and names to the things that I'm talking about. It's another Bay Area company called Recology that is a large ESOP. They are a waste management company, and they became employee-owned in 1986, but they're over 100 years old, the company itself. And I also was lucky enough to tour this company a few years ago. This is Sean, one of the employee owners, with one of his fans. This was a mom and son team that was watch his truck come by every week, and he let him in for a ride one morning. But this, again, I just wanted to point it out because when I was there listening to all the different stories, it was amazing at a company of this scale to really see not only multiple generations. I met multiple, 2 or 3 family members who had been connected to this company in different ways, and everyone from people in the business office to the transfer stations to the recycling centers all talked with this great pride and ownership. So just another one to look to if you're interested in reading more or understanding how an ESOP could work at a high level, a large level rather. Okay, and now I'm going to switch back to employee-owned or worker-owned cooperatives and do a quick overview of some of the details here. So as I mentioned before, they can be very small, they can also be very large. The employees of the business are the owners and the shareholders, and membership is open to everyone based on set criteria. They buy in to the co-op at an equal amount, and that amount is set by the founders and the board. And then annual profits are distributed to employees equitably. That's a really key piece of worker-owned co-ops, and that can be based on hours worked or really any equitable formula that the employee workers decide upon amongst themselves. Co-ops can have non-worker shareholders, but that can never be a majority. The workers always have to have a majority say. Again, we're talking about the governance level. And then worker co-ops are typically 100% employee owned, but there are possibilities to do buyouts of either the entire company, or they can be staged in different transactions. This note here is that there are some tax advantages for the seller that you can investigate if you go that direction. And from a technical assistance perspective, co-op buyouts cost on average around $10,000 to $20,000. Again, we're talking about assistance from a legal perspective, possibly just all the technical assistance that would be needed to make that happen. So it's more possible for smaller companies, not as investment heavy, to make it happen. And then for startups, starting up a new worker co-op is pretty much a similar cost as starting any traditional business. There's not too much cost-wise that's different. There's a lot of differences you can imagine in setting up the structure, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end here. And I wanted to just give a shout out here later today, if you're interested in more detail about starting up co-ops. Linda Phillips is going to be giving a presentation at 2 p.m. called How to Start or Convert Your Business to a Cooperative. And Morgan, maybe we can talk a little bit more about that at the end, but there will be lots of great information then about all these details.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. All right, so here's a look at worker cooperative governance. And again, just kind of boiling it down to the simple entities here. We have the board of directors in this case, we have the employee owners or the shareholders, and management may or may not exist within a worker co-op. I'll talk about that in a minute, but just to reiterate here, every employee has one vote, big defining piece of the worker co-op. They can operate with or without this management structure. Some like the bakery I mentioned earlier, we operated without a management structure because essentially everybody is an owner, and there's a great financial incentive to do that if you can, because of course you're reducing the level of pay to have management on top of people who are essentially acting as owners on a day-to-day basis. But as companies grow and get bigger, they definitely often need a whole management level. And so that can look really pretty much identical to any traditional company. Management can be set up. But again, it comes back to the difference being that those governance decisions, the big strategic level, the people making those votes are all of the employee owners. Everyone that works there gets one equal say, no matter what their role is or their pay level, etc. And a national example I wanted to point out here of a worker-owned cooperative, which is on the larger end, is Equal Exchange, which you may have heard of. They are over 130 worker owners. They are spread out all over the country and over 30 years old. They are a fair trade business that sells chocolate, coffee, and tea. They also have some retail cafe locations. Last I checked, they had over $50 million in sales. And I think they're just a really good example, again, on a larger scale, to show how this type of governance decision making can work. They're making decisions with people based in different locations all over the country, but everybody still has that one vote that equates to everybody else's on the way the company is run and managed. And they have lots of information online about their company. Lots has been written about it. So again, another great example to look to if you're looking for inspiration on successful worker-owned cooperatives. So now I want to take a minute to switch to just a couple of the other less well-known, less used EO models or pathways. There's some things called employee-owned or perpetual trusts. There's also some stock sharing programs. And then wanted to mention that many companies take gradual steps to full or broad-based employee ownership. It's not something that's either or, you either are or you aren't. So there's lots of ways to look at how you can integrate in not only, democratic values, input from the employees, all the way up to full financial shares and financial stake for the employees. So definitely you could reach out to RMEOC for more information about these types of things if one of the two directions is not exactly the path that makes sense for you. There's different ways to explore what that might look like. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about some different pathways into employee ownership. So I'm going to start with the steps of starting a worker-owned co-op, and then we'll talk a little bit also about how you could convert a cooperative. So let's see. Here's a nice little step-by-step chart. You can see kind of the high level again. Of course, starting a business is super complex, but we're talking about just some of the big steps. And a lot of it is the same as I imagine you envision for any sort of startup. It's not going to be much different for a cooperative. The details really come in the structure of the legal documents like the bylaws, membership details. But you're going to start with assembling a needs assessment. And one thing to point out here is where we say assemble a group, it is usually good for a co-op to start with a group of people, typically 3 or more, right from the start. So that if you're setting up all of these structures and understanding of how you're going to operate, that the main team, the main set of owners are there to make those decisions. Although it can happen differently where one person has a vision and starts to move forward and brings people in. But typically, if the earlier you can get the group of people involved who will be that core group of owners, the better for everybody. Then you're going to assess feasibility, prepare a business plan, just like normal, or a business model canvas, if you've heard of that. I'm going to take a minute and just talk about that. It's a great collective tool. You're developing new structures or processes, the membership details, and here membership is used interchangeably with ownership. Often members of co-ops are called that rather than owners. So you might see that in some of the stuff you read if you dive into information about them. And then holding initial meetings, preparing management, and eventually starting operations for whatever business you're starting. And just a quick side note here on the business model canvas, I don't know if this is something maybe even that's being talked about in other sessions or if it's come up. This is a tool to envision a business from a seed idea, just like a business plan, but it has a little separate focus. It drills down into mostly the customer segments, your value proposition. But what I really like about this is that we've often done workshops with it where you can blow up this whole canvas that's set up by a company called Strategizer, a book that's out there that's been used for traditional and cooperatives, traditional companies and co-ops. But if you blow this up as a big poster board, essentially, we've been able to do this brainstorming with groups of people. And I think it pulls people out of this mentality of thinking that a business plan is something that has to be just written out, very in-depth, very detailed. With this, we've taken just sticky notes. You can see if you read a little bit about it, that's how they advise doing it. So you're just putting these really high-level ideas up on a board. And it's a great way for any kind of collective startup to take the pressure off that business planning and have a little fun, start to think about where the money is going to come. How are you going to make money? What are you going to sell? Why is a customer going to have any interest in what you have to sell? And how are you going to communicate those channels? How are you going to connect to those customers? And we've even had people who think more visually, can draft little pictures on their sticky notes instead of words. So I think from a business startup perspective, it's just a really awesome model that allows people who think they might not know how to start a business to find a path in and realize, in fact, they do have incredibly creative, exciting ideas that are viable for business. And now back to one other pathway of employee ownership. This would be the steps to convert a current company. So the overview here, as you can see from the steps, is less on anything to do with the actual company itself, but it's more on structuring the goals that are specific to that company for this conversion, for setting up this trust or this ESOP. So you want to define goals, explore all the options, similarly assess feasibility, assemble any key players, also develop new structures, and then structuring the deal is where a lot of the technical advising comes in. And then, of course, complete the transaction, and then they can support the new company that is employee owned at that point. So if you are thinking about employee ownership, here are just a few ideas of things that you might be wanting to think about as you're getting going. So for startups, talked about this a few times, but again, you have this core group of people. Really great to start envisioning, talking about it with a group, because with a co-op, you're starting with bylaws and all sorts of documents that assume there's going to be these collective structures, collective ways of making decisions. If you're already in business, how is your revenue stream? Is it steady? Is it growing? How is your profit margin? Another thing to look to is trust between employees and owners and managers if you have them. Obviously, it starts to become incredibly important to have that trust between everyone, as everyone starts to have a greater say, possibly, if there's the democratic side of things with votes and everything. But also everyone's just getting more connected in to the benefits, the profits of the company. Think about whether there is already or not empowered decision-making at the shop floor level. The intent of a lot of these companies is to bring in the opinions and input from people at all levels of the company. That's where a lot of the efficiency and productivity gains are made. And sharing of information, strategy or finances, how does that happen? Is that happening at all? In a lot of worker co-ops, there's what's called open book management, open book sharing. At the bakery I worked at, we used to share all of the financials every month with everyone. And we would even bring in any candidate owners, people who were looking at possibly joining the company, into those discussions and give some training around how do you read financial documents, because everyone starts to have a vote and a say in those sorts of pieces of information of the business. And then incentives tied to performance. How does each employee contribute to overall success? So that's all I have right now. Thanks so much for your time. I wanted to put up RMEOC's contact info here. Here's my email, phone number, and also just mention for everyone here in Colorado, the Employee Ownership Network. This website is just a fabulous source of information with tons of information. We're really lucky to have a lot of great co-op support here in the state. And I'd love to dive into any questions. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ashley, so very much. It's actually very funny. I think Linda Phillips is watching our YouTube stream, and she says, thanks for the shout out. And I would agree. I'm excited for her session this afternoon as well. Here, if you would like to view the stream, please. Cool. F. Rodriguez asks on YouTube a couple questions. One which is a little more broad, and then there's one that's a little more particular. And the first is, what are your personal thoughts about the balance between automation and AI as it relates to businesses who may be able to boost revenue by doing or selling more, but it spurs job loss? And maybe even to link that deeply to some of the employee ownership businesses that you know, or excuse me, employee-owned businesses that you know that may be addressing this problem.
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's a super challenging one, I think, for any business. And I mentioned it a little bit with Alvarado Street Bakery. That really popped into my mind too, as we're thinking about crises and all of these challenges, and as things are developing and people are having to make really hard calls, right? Even in good times, that's hard to know that a new technology is coming out that can double your production, but it would eliminate, say, half your workforce. And that's incredibly hard if you're the one having to sit there to vote and have that be your job, that's going to eliminate. But what I like about the co-op model is that everyone does get a say in that, and there needs to be a discussion about it before it happens. So in terms of just feeling engaged and like you matter in your workplace, I think it's a really huge thing. Even if a hard decision is going to happen, which it has to happen all the time in co-ops, they often have to make decisions just like any other company to keep profit margins up. But at least you're getting to do that, and you get to hear everybody's opinions and make the best decision possible. And with Alvarado Street, again, they have this huge plant now. It's pretty amazing, the amount of technology. And as I said, they started by just making some loaves of bread 30 some years ago. But I think one of the examples I talked about was making bagels. It was something where there were these great machines that were coming up that could make that so much easier. But it was a hard choice around how that change was going to happen. And they've had to make that hard call and let some people go. But one person did mention that they've actually not taken up every direction that's come to them for technology. They've passed on some, they've picked up others, and just together they've been able to make those decisions. So I think that's the benefit is, or maybe it wouldn't be for some people, but to be in the room when that decision is being made, I guess that's a good thing. You're going to hear about it probably one way or the other. Right. You can speak up and make the case for it. So I think it's obviously essential. Every business, no matter whether it's employee owned or not, has to be successful from a financial perspective to be a business. So it's going to have to happen, but hopefully, the voices of the employees are there, and everyone can make a decision that helps. Also, with going forward, right? I think knowing that you've made that decision in a way that everybody gets behind at the end, whether it's hard, it feels better to go back out to work the next day, knowing that didn't just come out of nowhere and someone's just gone all of a sudden. And so I think that's where they talk about in times of crises that the productivity can stay more secure. Things are just a little bit easier if that's happening with your input and knowledge, and you get your voice in that decision making.
It's awesome. They also asked, you mentioned the silver tsunami. Is there a parallel pattern among a different age group that may coincide with it, like an increasing tick of entrepreneurship among our younger Gen Z or millennials? And maybe I'm curious as an addendum to this, is like, are the boomers, are the baby boomers who are owning these companies selling to the younger generation, especially much younger, like Gen Z and millennials, instead of just the immediate Gen X, I think is the interim one. So
yeah, I actually don't know. It's a really good question. Now I want to find out for sure. Yeah. It makes sense to me that there would be. I think the reason why this silver tsunami is talked about so much is just, as I mentioned before, it's a huge amount of businesses that we've just never seen that many millions, over 9 million, all at once in this one grouping. So I'm sure this is happening, and there's parallel patterns. My guess is it's not as many businesses that are coinciding, but for sure, the entrepreneurship among those different generations. I think the word co-op and the business model is becoming more well known, especially since 2008, which I mentioned a couple of times. That was a really big time, which some of you might remember, starting to hear about co-ops. And if you look in the history of co-ops, you start to see that's happened in big times of crises. People look to co-ops because all of a sudden you're looking around to try to find different resources for help. And so since 2008, I think people are just starting to know about co-ops more. They're starting to know that they can be bigger. There's a whole platform co-op realm now around technology, which is really fascinating, and starting to tap into different types of businesses who are using collective structures. So yeah, I'm sure there's this parallel path, and I hope there is, among the larger entrepreneurship, and that co-op is becoming, again, like not just this, like it's a small grocery store or something, but that it actually can be and represent companies on big scales, from technological perspectives to making bread, and all industries. That's awesome. All different sizes.
Absolutely. All right. Question from Facebook. Dan is asking, how do employee transitions work? Like new hires and exits. In this case, I take exits as in like they're leaving and not an exit strategy.
Yeah, I'm going to talk mostly about worker co-ops. That's more my knowledge base. That's fairly similar from what I understand with ESOPs. It's very similar actually to a regular company. And again, all of this can be different for different companies, but in general, when somebody is brought on often cases, though, it is a little bit of a longer period. A lot of co-ops have what's called a candidacy period. Right, so instead of just hiring somebody that is your employee, you're possibly thinking that this person is going to be a co-owner with you. So you might be asking more about their background, their views, their things on applications. You might want to have a longer hiring process. Some companies have candidacy periods that are upwards of like 3 to 5 years even. Some are shorter, 6 months. At the bakery I was at, it was a 6-month candidacy period. So you're brought on, and at that point you're hired, and on a day-to-day basis, you're learning your shift, your skills, whatever it is, the work that you do. But also typically you're being brought along during that candidacy period to learn everything from how the governance does work, about finances of the business, because at whatever point you get hired, there will be a membership vote, and all of the current owners would vote in. And again, this is worker co-ops. I'm not exactly sure. It varies a lot with ESOPs. It can be more traditional in an ESOP. But in a co-op, because all the owners are the employees, they would vote whether or not they want you to join the business, not only as an employee, but also as a new owner. So at that point, you have to be pretty ready to engage, not only doing the work that you do, but also as an owner. And then for exits, it can also be very similar, where it really comes down to a vote of the owners. Obviously, it's often much more emotionally challenging if this person is someone you've been in business with and you're sharing profits with and making all of the business decisions. It's a bigger decision, but it's a fairly simple transaction at the end of the day. It can just be a vote. That person is terminated and their ownership ends at that point.
And whether it's voluntary or not, then I know you had mentioned around ESOPs that there's a cash transfer usually based on their stake in the trust. But for a worker-owned co-op, has that been distributed over the time that they are a worker owner, or at that point of either termination or they're leaving their job? Is there some distribution based on their ownership?
Yep. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And so it can vary again on how different companies set it up, but typically people would be getting those profits throughout the time that they're working there on an annual or quarterly basis. And then also once they leave, there would be an arrangement with the company that's either paid out then, or oftentimes it's paid out over time after you leave, because a lot of times if it's a smaller company, if somebody leaves, it's not like all of a sudden you just have all of that money sitting there. Hopefully you do, but that's all preset in the bylaws and all of the structure of the company to say how long those payouts would happen, and you could get those for several years after you leave. So you're guaranteed those profits when you're working there, and it's just a matter of timing of how those are paid out after you leave.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you again, Ashley. I'm going to do my little LSW 20 song and jig for a hot moment. You can buy swag, everybody who's watching. If you want to support our local entrepreneurial organizations in Longmont, all of the net proceeds from the sales of these t-shirts and associated sticker sheets are going to be donated to those organizations. That's for E4All Longmont, who you heard in the earlier session, and Innovate Longmont to help support our local entrepreneurial crew. So you can go, oh, Dan Christian has another question, but I'll finish this song and jig really quick. You can go to longmontstartupweek.co/shop and find either our pocket tee or the standard tee, which is the one I just showed you, and you can pick them up in Longmont at a couple sites. All right. Dan, as another question, I've heard about horizontal or non-hierarchical organizations. How would co-ops relate to that?
Yeah, some co-ops would be exactly that. Some are not, and I think that's also important to remember. There's no one size fits all for co-ops. You can either have horizontal management or no management, or you can have hierarchy just the same. Like one example, I've worked with some construction companies. I think it's a good one to look at, and also some landscape design build companies. And in those cases, they are all owners. They're a worker-owned co-op, so they're all equal owners. So again, they would all have equal decision-making and a horizontal structure on the governance level. So at board meetings, et cetera, strategic items. But on the job site, right, there has to be a hierarchy in those companies. Not everybody can't have a say. And if you're a carpenter or a plumber, you're going to have to make some hierarchical decisions or be working over certain people who have lesser knowledge than you for safety, for all the productivity. So in those cases, you could have a very traditional hierarchy in the field if you wanted to, and then it's just taking off that hat when you get back into the boardroom. That's the key, is that people have to be able to have hierarchy and not hierarchy in those cases. Some work completely horizontal or non-hierarchical throughout. Again, if you're not in an industry that needs it, you could run the whole company at a horizontal level. Everyone has a say in everything. But from an efficiency standpoint, that often breaks down pretty quickly if you're of any sort of scale or doing certain work. But that does happen. It's fantastic. That has a huge amount of buy-in from everybody. And then you can just go from there, setting up structures that are necessary for the type of work. And then hopefully those hierarchies disappear when the other decisions have to be made. But it's a really great system in that way, I think, for people to learn about having a democratic say, though. In our country, being a democracy, you really start to learn what that feels like to have a say, at least in one portion of a place where you spend a large amount of your days and hours. Even if you have to switch and work under someone during the day for efficiency and safety and all of that, there's this place where you really get to share your opinion and have it affect your work and your profits.
Nice. Yeah, and I think on this, what's interesting to me listening to your presentation is that the cooperative structure puts real money and governance behind being non-hierarchical or horizontal, while a lot of companies could be horizontal or try to be not have much management, but there's no governance or financial structure that really puts, let's say, their money where their mouth is. And the co-ops really, in this case, a worker co-op could really solidify that.
For sure, yeah.
That's awesome. All right, well, Ashley, thank you again so much for joining us at LSW 20. It's been such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
And we'll be back in just a few minutes with two folks from our city sustainability program to talk about Longmont's sustainability program. So we'll see you in a little. Thanks all.
Bye.